Most of you are aware of the difference between Platonic realism and nominalism. If you are not familiar with this, I would encourage you to go ahead and do some research because it is one of those issues which lie at the heart of Western thinking. This deals with, in a certain sense, Platonism versus Aristotelianism, and every subsequent thinker can more or less be grouped into the Platonic or Aristotelian camp. I am a Platonic realist, and in many senses a Platonist. So, we live in a nominalist world, though. We live in an Aristotelian world. That can be probably accounted for actually using some of Carl Schmitt's thinking. In addition to the theological origins of nominalism, which have been outlined by some guy who wrote a book that Ivan the Heathen has done an excellent series on, the theological origins of modernity. Peter Abelard and then William of Ockham were important in producing this line of thought, and that was derived ultimately from the unbounded will of God. If the will of God is absolute, then he doesn't obey the laws of reason. He creates the laws of reason, and it is possible for him to abrogate them. They're not absolute. Only the will of God is absolute. And therefore, when we observe uniformities, a chair is not destined always to be a chair. A triangle is not destined always to be a true possibility. God might revoke the ability for triangles to form, or for the concept of a triangle to exist. But yeah, using Carl Schmitt's thinking, we move from central domains of thought. So we moved from the, theological, and got violent, eventually, over this common domain of battle, and moved to the metaphysical. But this likewise produced conflict. Eventually, a neutral central domain for engagement becomes fraught. And this happened with theology and then metaphysics. So from there, physics would be the pithy way of expressing this, but science, material science, is a new, I'm spelling that right, a new central domain. And nominalism can be seen as this shift expressing itself. Metaphysics became too contentious, but we can all at least agree upon empirical fact. So whatever theoretical framework we use to surround scientific fact, science at least is some place where we can all speak in a civilized manner. That's proven to be false. It's a false hope. Science is not neutral, and neither is technology. But in any case, that's probably why we live in a nominalist world, because the shift fell onto scientific empirical matters in serious intellectual and ideological dispute. So, I will argue against nominalism using nominalism. If the conclusion is true that universal patterns are not truly universal, that is, they don't stand apart from their instantiations but are reliant ultimately upon instantiation in a material world. If that's true, then even the laws of physics, even the forces of nature, are not true ideas in the Platonic sense. They don't exist within themselves. They exist only as particular behavior of particular matter. And the fact that we think that they are universal is a product of our fallibility. We label these things, and the label makes us believe that these things are actually ubiquitous, actually universal, actually independent. And the same goes for mathematical properties. So numbers, we think are so self-evident, and we think are at the core of many material phenomena. Plenty of material things seem to rely upon their ultimately numerical qualities, either as scalars or vectors. But the nominalist has to say that no, one is just a label. You know, the numbers exist only as this, as writing them down, as thinking of them as numbers. And there's a certain kind of nobility actually in that, you know, we can't assume that the way that we label it is the way it actually is. And you can take a tentative form of nominalism which says that we are agnostic to the reality of the triangle outside of our conceptualization of triangularity, or any universal property, you know, whiteness. Likewise, we think of whiteness in this conceptual abstract way. Maybe there is a real pattern, a real kind of universal pattern that we're referring to, but our label is inadequate. That is not typically the direction that nominalists take, because then you are just saying that we're using heuristics, which I don't think most realists deny. Yes, our language is inadequate. It's not perfectly encapsulating the true universals. The debate is, are there true universals? So the nominalist has to say, no, there are no laws of physics. There are no absolute forces. These things are not universal, and therefore they are subject to change. That goes back to this unlimited will of God. If that's the case, the only way to really accommodate that is to suggest that material reality is self-instantiating and infinite. It is essentially that unbounded will of God, changing everywhere. But if you're going to say that that nominalist framework exists in a finite universe, then it's mere happenstance that certain laws govern certain regions. Right? This just so happens to be this way in this place, and we can't explain why at all. Because to explain why the finite universe evolves in this particular way, you'd have to invoke some concept of a universal beyond materiality. So that's not acceptable for me. The only way you can make sense of nominalism is to say that that's the case. An infinite universe is the case. Now, if that's your premise as the nominalist, I will use that premise to defeat nominalism. So, we are arguably finite within an infinite universe. And in an infinite universe, any particular finitude must occur infinitely many times. So already, any particular finitude, and let's just deal with us, right? This is my perception in this moment. My perception in this moment exists here in an infinite universe. It also exists here. So, where do I exist? Is my position dependent upon a particular location in the causal nexus? Yes, in the causal nexus. That is, my causal nexus, everything I'm interacting with and therefore perceiving at some level, whether consciously or subconsciously. You can argue about the possibility of subconscious perception, depends on how you define perception, but interaction could be termed a form of perception, or at least informing the subject, right? So yes, the causal nexus goes out to this unspecified region and is really just an extrapolation of my conscious experience. It depends on that set of connections. That's my true identity. Beyond that, in terms of a location in space, it doesn't matter. So causality turns out to be not a property of particular things in a particular space-time space, but a property of the identity of, in this case, the observer. Likewise, our ability to perceive space and time is a quality of our minds, right? not too long ago in historical time, Immanuel Kant brought to Western consciousness the fact that space-time and causality are forms of human cognition. And that can actually be seen as falling out of nominalism. But it is our way of approaching reality to ascribe to it space, time, and causality. And that's actually the fastest way of defeating nominalism, pointing out that the material reality in which these patterns are abstracted itself, the empirical reality, is, in a sense, just a label. Empirical reality is just a form of our thinking. And thinking there is in the broadest sense. Okay, so, yeah, infinite universe means these identities are what they are, independent of where they exist in the infinite space. Right? And if you have infinite space, that means that every event that ever could occur has already occurred and is actually in fact occurring right now. Which means that the flow of time and causality that we think gives rise to uniformities, which we label in the nominalist paradigm, is not fundamental. Because every moment arrived at in this flow of time, in that flow of time, has already occurred in time and is occurring in space. So A is not produced by the flow of time. The flow of time is actually produced in a certain sense, in a literal sense. Our conception of time. Time is a product of the identity of the observer. So it's actually hard to tell in Plato whether he believed that abstract entities like triangles were the real ideas, or rather that organic entities like a tree or a human were the real ideas. I don't stick too close to Plato, and it's actually, again, hard to see what Plato was really saying. But at least in this like empirically based worldview, if the universe is infinite, then any uniformity occurs infinitely many times, always from the perspective of the observer. So, like the idea that a triangle exists apart from its material instantiation does not actually then preclude the possibility that the true triangle is dependent upon a perspective which sees it, which is logical, actually. Non-perceiving things, non-living things, and material particles could be conceived as living in a sense, if you're going to accept a variety of pan-proto-experientialism. But yeah, non-organic entities, abstract entities like this, would rely upon a perspective which sees the thing. Because if you don't have that perspective, you don't have this point being particularly this far away from this point. If you have no perspective on the triangle, there's no difference of position of anything. So all forms, in the formal sense, rely upon the perspective there to observe them. Now, Plato also says that the ideas are actually not in space and time. So the possibility for identity A, which is reproduced infinitely many times in the cosmos, the possibility for any given identity to create something like a triangle in its mind is there and always has been there, and is not in a causal, teleological fashion the product of the presence of A. It was there always. And you can see why Platonic realism leads to theism and monotheism, just like Plato arrived at monotheism arguably independent of the religious traditions of his area. Some people would say that the cult of Eleusis, which Plato was initiated into, was in fact occult monotheism, and that occult monotheism was at the heart of most of the pagan traditions of the Mediterranean. But that was reserved for an elite. The majority of people believe in gods. So, yeah, that leads to monotheism, because the possibility for any given observer to conceptualize of anything in the first place, any particular mathematical, geometric property, those possibilities, as possibilities, always existed. And those possibilities are not within space and time. Space and time is a product, or a property rather, of the observer. Possibilities are outside of space and time, because even space and time exist as possibilities. So forms of potentiality, not yet instantiated in a particular material nexus, are the true ideas, the true forms. So I don't think many people actually understand Platonic realism, to be frank. And I'm not saying that I have a perfect understanding of it. And I'd really like this to be the beginning of a discussion on this topic, and any objections or, anything would be welcome. But yeah, this is at the core of a lot of my philosophy. And I think things like ethics and politics can actually be derived from this stuff. So, as always, thank you for listening.